Okay, ready for a deep dive that might just turn things upside down a bit?
I'm always up for a good mental workout. What are we tackling today?
Well, we're diving into loving your enemies from a Christian perspective.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It really is. And we're using these thought-provoking reflections from thickshades.com to guide us. This whole idea, it's one of those things that feels both really tough and strangely compelling at the same time.
Absolutely. It's like one of those things in the Christian faith that seems completely counterintuitive, like it goes against every instinct we have as humans?
Exactly. It's like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to, what? Love the person who just cut me off in traffic or gossiped about me at work. It feels almost impossible.
Right.
And that's what Thick Shades dives into right away, this idea that it's actually a command to love our enemies. Not just put up with them, but actively, genuinely love them.
And I think that's where Thick Shades gets really interesting because they highlight that inherent tension between what we're called to do and our human nature. Like when someone hurts us, our natural response is to protect ourselves, maybe even retaliate, right? But this whole concept of loving our enemies, it disrupts that whole fight or flight response.
So true. So if it goes so against our very nature, where does this command even come from? Like, why are we even told to do something that feels so difficult, so unnatural?
Well, according to Thick Shades, it's not some random rule. It's actually rooted in the very character of God himself. It's
Yeah.
about mirroring God's own love.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
hmm
How does loving my enemy, like the person who really gets under my skin, how does that connect to this bigger picture of reflecting God's love?
Think about it this way. Before we came to faith, we were all, in a sense, God's enemies. We were separated from him by our own choices, our sin. But he still chose to love us.
Right.
He offered us grace and redemption through Jesus.
And Thick Shades even pulls in Romans 5.8 here, which says, God demonstrates his own love toward us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
Powerful verse. It flips the script. God's love isn't based on what we do or don't deserve. It flows from who he is. And that's the radical love we're called to show others.
So we're called to love not because the other person has earned it, but because that's who God is and the kind of love we're called to reflect to the world.
Exactly. And the most powerful example of this, of course, is Jesus himself. He is the ultimate example of loving your enemies.
And Thick Shades really drives this home. They talk about how Jesus willingly gave his life on the cross, even for those who were actively persecuting him, mocking him in his final moments. If Jesus could love in the face of that, what does that mean for us?
Right. It's a high calling, for sure. And I think that's why Thick Shades then makes this distinction that's crucial to understanding this whole idea of enemies. They talk about Satan as God's enemy, someone described as being beyond repentance. And then they contrast that with our human enemies, the people we struggle to love in our everyday lives.
Okay, so why even bring up Satan in a conversation about, like, loving your coworker who takes credit for all your ideas?
Because it gets at the heart of hope and change. Thick Shades is saying with our human enemies, even when it seems impossible, there's always that glimmer of possibility that they could have a change of heart, that they could turn away from whatever's driving those hurtful actions.
So with our human enemies, there's always that chance, that hope for redemption, a chance for the relationship to change. But with Satan, that's not the case.
That's how Thick Shades seems to be framing it, yeah. It's a pretty intense concept, this idea that there are some beings, some spiritual forces that are so opposed to God that there's no longer a possibility for reconciliation. But with us humans, there's always that glimmer of hope, that possibility that things could change.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. So if we're called to love our enemies because they have the potential to change, to choose a different path, then what happens when they don't? What happens when you've tried to love someone, to extend grace, but they just keep hurting you?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where Thick Shades really leans into trusting God's justice, even when it's hard to understand or feels unfair.
So recognizing that our role isn't to take revenge or force someone to change, but love them as best we can and leave the ultimate outcome to God.
You got it. Surrendering that need to see things made right in our timing or in our way.
And Thick Shades quotes Romans 12.19 here, which says, Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.
Ooh, yeah.
Powerful stuff, but definitely not always easy to live out, especially when you feel like someone has hurt you and gotten away with it.
Yeah.
It's like we're being asked to let go of that desire to see the scales balanced and trust God will handle it.
It's a posture of humility for sure. And it's not about pretending what the other person did was okay or didn't hurt. It's about making a conscious choice to release them and the offense into God's hands instead of letting anger and bitterness take root in our own hearts.
So not condoning their actions, but choosing to respond differently, to
Yeah.
break the cycle of hurt and retaliation.
Exactly. Choosing a higher way, a love rooted in something bigger than ourselves, something that can bring genuine healing and freedom even when things are really tough.
This is really making me think.
Yeah.
But this doesn't mean we become doormats, right? I mean, Thick Shades also talks about the importance of boundaries, especially when dealing with someone who keeps hurting you, even when you're extending love and grace.
Mm.
How do we reconcile these ideas of loving unconditionally, but also setting healthy boundaries?
You're hitting on something super important. And Thick Shades actually address this directly. They point us back to Jesus' teachings in Matthew 18.15-17.
Okay, what does Jesus have to say about boundaries, especially in the context of dealing with difficult people?
Well, in Matthew 18, Jesus lays out this process for dealing with someone who's wronged you. It starts with going to that person directly, one-on-one, to try and work things out.
So step one, no more airing grievances on social media. It's about having that face-to-face conversation, even though it might be uncomfortable.
Yes. It's about valuing the relationship enough to address the issue head-on, with grace and humility, of course. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes on to say if the person refuses to listen, refuses to acknowledge their wrongdoing or repent, even after you've tried to reconcile, the next step is to bring in others.
So, like trusted friends or mentors who can help mediate the situation.
Right. But here's what I find fascinating. Even then, Jesus provides a way to protect yourself if the person is still being unrepentant and harmful. He says that if they still refuse to listen, even after all that, you're to treat them as a heathen man and a publican.
A heathen man and a publican. Okay, that sounds a little harsh, to be honest.
It definitely does to our modern ears, but in Jesus' time, it meant you were no longer obligated to maintain the same level of close fellowship with that person. It was about recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to create some distance.
So, not about completely cutting them off or writing them off as hopeless, but recognizing you need to protect your own well-being sometimes.
Exactly. You can still love that person from afar, pray for them, wish them well, but you don't have to subject yourself to ongoing hurt and mistreatment in the name of loving your enemy.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So loving someone doesn't mean you have to be their punching bag.
Exactly. It's about that balance between loving unconditionally and setting those healthy boundaries to protect your own heart and mind.
You know, as we're talking about this, one thing that really stood out to me from the Thick Shades piece was this idea of releasing the need to see our enemies change. Almost like they're saying that true love isn't contingent upon their response, their transformation. It's more about what's happening in our own hearts.
That is so insightful, and I think that gets at the transformative power of this kind of love. It's about choosing to align ourselves with God's love, which is constant and unconditional, even when it's not reflected back to us.
Wow. So less about them and their response and more about us stepping into that space of radical, unconditional love.
Yes. It's about letting God's love work in and through us to free us from bitterness, resentment, and unforgiveness.
So to love our enemies isn't about trying to change them, but about allowing something to change in us.
In a way, yes. It's about recognizing that true freedom and peace come from aligning ourselves with God's love and trusting in His ultimate justice.
This deep dive is really making me think about some of the relationships in my own life where I've been hurt or there's some ongoing conflict. It's definitely challenging to think about how I might show up differently, not to change the other person, but to find some freedom and healing for myself. What about you? What's resonating with you as we're talking about all of this?
It definitely is a process. And it's not like our own need for healing and our desire to see the other person change. Like those two things are always separate, you know?
Totally. It's that C.S. Lewis quote, right? Everyone thinks forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. But here's something I thought was really interesting in the Thick Shades piece. They actually present loving your enemies as a gift to ourselves.
Oh, interesting. How so?
They have this analogy about how holding on to anger and resentment towards someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Wow. Yeah, that is a powerful image. And it really highlights how much holding on to those negative emotions, how much it can affect us. Like we're the ones who end up trapped in that cycle of pain and bitterness. You know what I mean?
That's it. Thick Shades is suggesting that when we choose to love, Even when it's hard, when we don't feel like it, we're actually taking this huge step towards freeing ourselves from that burden.
Yeah, and it's not about saying what that person did was okay or minimizing the hurt we might have experienced, but choosing to respond differently, to break free from the pain and resentment.
It's like choosing to see ourselves and that other person, our enemy, through a different lens, right? One of compassion, grace, maybe even humor sometimes.
Humor. Okay, now that's an interesting angle. You think there's room for laughter in all of this?
I think so. Because honestly, sometimes the situations we're in, the things people do, they're just ridiculous.
Right.
And I think finding a way to laugh at how absurd it all is without, downplaying the seriousness could be a healthy way to deal with things.
I like that. Not taking ourselves too seriously, finding those moments of lightness even when things are tough.
Exactly. And I think if we can laugh at ourselves a bit, it makes loving those difficult people a little easier.
Yeah, I see what you mean. When we laugh at ourselves, it helps us let go of that need to be right, to have the last word.
Yes. And that's where I think Thick Shades is really onto something, with this whole idea of releasing the need to see our enemies change. It's like they're saying, what if the transformation you're looking for, the healing, actually begins with you?
That is a radical shift in perspective. So instead of putting all our energy into changing the other person, it's about focusing on our own hearts, our responses, our willingness to choose love and forgiveness.
Isn't that what Jesus did, really? He didn't wait for us to get our act together before offering us love and forgiveness. He loved us right in the middle of it.
Exactly. That's the kind of love we're called to model. A love that's not dependent on what the other person does or how things turn out, but that just flows freely from a place of grace and compassion.
So practically speaking, what are some steps we can take when we're faced with this challenge of loving our enemies? Like when we're feeling that anger and resentment bubbling up?
Thick Shades actually gives some really helpful advice here. They talk about the importance of prayer, even when you don't feel like it.
You mean even when you're fuming mad and praying for that person is the absolute last thing on your mind?
Especially then, because sometimes prayer is the only way we can even begin to tap into a supernatural love and grace that's big enough to overcome those negative emotions.
So it's about connecting to a power outside of ourselves, a love that's not limited by our own human capacity, right?
Right. And it might not change the other person, but it can change us. It can soften our hearts, help us see things more clearly, and respond differently.
That's really helpful, thanks. What else does Thick Shades suggest?
They also talk about forgiveness. And not just saying the words, but genuinely releasing that person from what you feel they owe you, even if you don't think they deserve it.
Man, that is tough. Because it's like we want to hold on to that hurt, that anger, like it's a way of protecting ourselves from getting hurt again.
It's a natural response, for sure. But what Thick Shades is saying is that holding on to that hurt, it's not protecting us. It's actually imprisoning us.
We become prisoners of our own resentment.
Yeah. And forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It's about setting ourselves free. It's about breaking out of that cycle of pain and resentment and moving towards a place of healing.
So not about saying what they did was okay, but about choosing to let go of the power it has over us.
That's it. And that's a choice we have to make sometimes every single day, every hour even. Because let's face it, people can be messy. Relationships are complicated. We're all going to make mistakes and hurt each other at some point.
Speaking of messy and complicated, Thick Shades doesn't shy away from the reality that sometimes, even when we're trying our best to love our enemies, things don't magically work out.
Right. And that's where I think their emphasis on boundaries is so important. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for that other person is to create some distance.
Okay, let's talk about that because I think boundaries can be tricky. When we're talking about this idea of loving our enemies, what does setting healthy boundaries actually look like?
It's about recognizing that we are responsible for our own well-being. And sometimes that means taking a step back from relationships that are unhealthy or toxic, even as we continue to pray for those people and wish them well.
So it's not about shutting them out completely or giving up on them entirely, but it is about protecting ourselves from further harm.
Right. And that will probably look different in every situation. It might mean limiting contact, setting some firm boundaries about what you're willing to talk about, or even stepping away from the relationship completely for a while.
And I think the key is that it's not about punishing the other person, but about taking care of ourselves.
Absolutely. It's about acknowledging that we can't pour from an empty cup. We can't offer love and grace to others if we're not taking care of ourselves.
It's finding that balance between holding on to hope for the relationship while also recognizing that sometimes stepping back is the most loving thing we can do.
Yeah. And that's not always easy to do, but it can be really freeing.
And maybe that is part of the gift that Thick Shades is talking about, letting go of the need to control the situation, to change the other person, to force a specific outcome,
It's about letting go of our need to be right, to be vindicated.
and instead choosing to trust that God sees the bigger picture.
Yes, and that he will ultimately bring justice and healing in his perfect timing.
This is such a tough topic,
Mhm.
but there's so much freedom in letting go of the need to see our enemies change. Recognizing that real peace comes from choosing to align ourselves with God's love and trusting in his justice, not enforcing outcomes or controlling people.
It's about understanding that sometimes the bravest, most powerful thing we can do is to let go.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's one of those topics that you can never really fully exhaust, but I feel like we've uncovered some really important truths about what it means to truly love and forgive and the freedom that comes with letting go. And it makes you think, right?
Mhm.
Is there a relationship in your life, listener, where maybe you need to show some of this radical love and grace, maybe even to yourself? It's funny how often, no matter what we're talking about, it always seems to come back to us, you know? Like, maybe the toughest part of all this isn't actually loving someone else, even if it's hard, but about facing our own stuff, our own need to be right, to hold on to that hurt.
No doubt. And I think Thick Shades touches on that a bit too. They're careful to point out that loving your enemies, it's not about doing it to make them change, you know? It's about us choosing a love that's bigger than both of us.
So less about controlling the situation and more about surrendering to something beyond ourselves.
Exactly. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy or that they'll even notice or care, really. It's about getting to that place where we can say, okay, this hurt, it really did, but I'm choosing to find strength somewhere else.
You know, it's like what we were talking about before, mirroring God's love. God didn't wait for us to be perfect or get it all together before loving us. He loved us right in the middle of our mess.
Exactly. It's a powerful example. But honestly, there are times when it feels like loving someone like that is impossible. When you look at what happened and you're just like, there's no way I can find compassion or forgiveness for this person, not right now.
And that's where I think Thick Shades has some really good advice. They remind us that we don't have to force those feelings, that we can tap into something outside ourselves. They talk a lot about prayer, about asking God to fill us with his love, to help us see things, see that other person through his eyes.
That's so important. Sometimes asking for help, admitting we can't do it on our own, it's the only way we can find that love and forgiveness.
It's like admitting we're weak, that we have limits. That's what opens the door for God's strength to work in us. Maybe that's part of the paradox of this whole loving your enemies thing.
Yeah.
It's precisely when we feel weakest, least able to love, that's when we're closest to the source of love itself.
I love that. It's like that verse, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. We find strength when we let go.
What a journey this deep dive has been. We talked about hard stuff, the hurt, the anger, setting boundaries, even times when the most loving choice is to walk away. But we've also found some beautiful truths in here about radical love, the power of forgiveness, the freedom we find when we let go of control.
It's been great unpacking all of this with you. And you know, it's a good reminder that the Christian faith is full of things that seem contradictory, but those are often the places where we can experience the most amazing growth if we're willing to explore them.
And you know what? Sometimes that change, it starts with a simple question. What would it look like for me to love a little more bravely today? So, listener, as we wrap things up, we'll leave you with that. What could change in your life, in your relationships, if you chose to love a little more courageously, more freely, even when you've been hurt or let down? It's a question worth wrestling with. And who knows, in that struggle, you might just come face to face with a love that has the power to change everything.